Hi folks, Florida Man here, and today I bring you a video on chainsaw diplomacy, also known as when to be abrasive. In diplomacy, the usual rule is that the art of charm is the order of the day. Charm is almost a superpower, to the point of getting otherwise very sensible people to work with you when it's really not in their best interests, and persuading powers to throw centers to you in the endgame when they have to choose who they'd rather lose to. However, sometimes a situation arises where the art of charm hits a brick wall. Sometimes communications break down or become ineffective. Sometimes the situation becomes desperate, to the point that any further attack or betrayal will demolish your carefully constructed position and make your defeat nearly inevitable, and someone else's solo highly probable. In those situations, it's sometimes useful to have a rather unusual tool in your arsenal. A power tool. That's right, Florida Man fans, today we are discussing chainsaw diplomacy, the most destructive tool in the diplomacy garage until we start having nuclear weapons. Chainsaw diplomacy is when you need people to really believe that you mean what you're saying, and you start talking to your target audience in a way that's calculated to upset and unnerve them. After reading a message from you when you're doing this, the recipient should find that his or her hand is shaking. You should unsettle and scare the person. It's okay in these circumstances to be irrational, demanding, intimidating, and/or angry. Chainsaw diplomacy is not subtle by design. When is it appropriate to use such drastic measures? I could try to dig up a fair number of examples, but I've found it's not easy to illustrate this in practice, because most people don't naturally default to vigorous hostility if they don't get their way, and most people also typically don't jump to a style that's the polar opposite of their natural style. So most of what we see is a very small number of players who employ chainsaw-style diplomacy because it comes naturally to them, because they're angry already, and a very large number of players who don't use chainsaw diplomacy even when they should. I'll highlight examples specifically from a few games to sort of illustrate the broader point about how often and in what circumstances it's likely to be usable. First example, failure to use chainsaw diplomacy. So I was in a game fairly recently as England where I had been worn down to just my home centers plus a little piece of Scandinavia that I held at the pleasure of Russia. If you're on my Patreon, you already know about this game. Anyway, I had used my not insubstantial diplomatic skill to remain alive and relevant to the game, encouraging both Russia and Italy in pursuing the solo. I knew they would each have to demolish the other powers to get close to that goal, and that would help forestall my own defeat, since the Janissary frequently dies last. It was a desperation move, unavoidable in part because of a French player who had taken a dislike to me after a stab long in the past. Anyway, a point in the game came when Russia had pretty obvious designs on my home centers, as well as a plan to take my last non-home center. This is the point when I should have dropped the chainsaw on him. I should have made clear in no uncertain terms that if he continued advancing on me, I wouldn't fight anymore and I wouldn't try to negotiate, I would simply throw the game to Italy. In fact, that's actually what I did. In the end, I did throw the game to the Italian player. Sometimes I do that. What should and possibly could have happened is that I should have used chainsaw diplomacy and warned Russia forcefully to keep out of my last Scandinavia center and my seas, or I would throw to Italy. You need to imagine this as a much more forceful and aggressive statement than the way I'm currently saying it. Imagine that I'm holding an active thermal detonator. That's a grenade for people who haven't seen the original trilogy, and I'm very intimidating and threatening, and maybe I sound crazy. If I had done that, maybe I would have survived and forced my inclusion in the draw. At the least, I might have kept one of my invaders back, instead of them basically racing to see who could kill me off first, allowing me to play Kingmaker but not survive. Next example. Improper use of chainsaw diplomacy. In the game Scorched Earth, which I've previously made a commentary on, I'll link to that in the video description if I remember, there was a moment when it became contentious whether or not the game could continue, because the Italian player didn't enter moves in spring. So we held a vote on whether to end the game immediately or not. Only 2 players voted in favor of ending the game, Russia and Austria. We saw the Russian player become a bit ticked off at the whole group when the vote didn't go the way he wanted. Initially, it was sort of passive-aggressive. He threatened to enter all hold orders for the rest of the game if we didn't vote to end the game. Then, after the vote went against him, he said, "Second NMR from Italy, so I just get forced to play 6-person dip because a couple of very experienced dip players like the advantage it gives them? I don't think so." I responded, "A majority voted to keep playing. Only you and Austria, probably one of the 2 primary beneficiaries of the Italian surrender, voted to quit." I added in response to him saying, "So I just get forced to play," by saying, "No, do what you like. You already made clear you didn't intend to respect the outcome of the vote. You don't need to make excuses. No one can stop you from acting as you wish, and I think you're unlikely to persuade anyone that you were right to enter hold orders for every season." So he escalates here to an undefined threat. "I signed up to play diplomacy. This ain't diplomacy. But don't worry, I won't quit. I have a very special playing style for people just like you. You want your game? You got it." After this, everyone was pretty firmly against Russia. England and I each tried to use him as a pawn, and England was ultimately successful, but in fact, Russia wasn't able to make himself very useful to anyone, and we took him out pretty quickly. So I would call this the wrong play. Russia did not use chainsaw diplomacy correctly at all. He made the mistake of not having a specific objective. He wasn't at all clear about what he was threatening, or really even why he was making threats, and ultimately he didn't even follow through with his threat exactly. Beyond this point, I was able to work with him a little bit, despite how hostile he seemed in these messages. So Russia's approach was just completely counterproductive here. He was abrasive for no good reason, with no specific objective, and he alienated everyone, resulting in the death that shortly followed. Next example. Non-use of chainsaw diplomacy. Now, in that same game, I found myself needing to try and reclaim my former relationship with Austria after I had stabbed him. I sent him a message promising friendly moves that season, but I didn't hear back from him. Weighing my options, I decided to make those friendly moves anyway, and I found myself still under Austrian attack. At that point, I had to consider my options. My position was likely to deteriorate if I kept being under attack by Austria, and it could compromise the game for us. I could rant and rave and threaten and say whatever I could come up with to scare and intimidate Austria into falling into line, or I could silently try to fight him, or I could turn one of our neighbors on him, or I could try the soft approach, where I made a reasonable response and requested that he be reasonable in turn. That last one is what I actually did. Here was the message I led with. Austria, I really was trying to work with you in spring, as I'm sure my moves showed. Obviously, you were not willing to do so at that time, which I can appreciate. But Russia is just taking advantage of the chaos to try to recover his former position, while France is hoping to weaken us both and enjoy the spoils of our mutual collapse. Neither is a real ally for either of us, which is why I didn't want to trust Russia in spring. He is a pure opportunist. Do you want to stop fighting and try to work together, or both get eaten by the Entente and their Russian puppy? I can keep on fighting until we're both defeated. Turkey's position is inherently more defensible than Austria's, but I think we're both out of tactics that could create a dramatic improvement in our current situations unless we work together. Turkey. Austria responded favorably to that, and we had some back and forth about next steps until we made a decision together. At the end of that process, I did make sure to make clear that there would be consequences for betrayal, but not, I think, in a chainsaw diplomacy sort of way. I just said, if you use this season to attack me, instead of allowing me to reorient as you've suggested, though, I must warn you that I would at that point start helping France. It's a very simple message, but it made the stakes clear, and Austria and I worked together for the remainder of that game. Next, and final example, unsuccessful use of chainsaw diplomacy. In the game Verdun, I took over a flawed and vulnerable Italian position, and I spent much of my time trying to recover the position. Germany was in an increasingly dominant position himself, which was the major concern of most of the other powers. Unfortunately, as I began to be strong enough to move toward the Western Front, where Germany was trying to progress, my neighbor, Austria, began making furtive movements. If a police officer saw Austria moving like that, he'd yell, "Hands up!" Unfortunately, My little Italy was not the police officer for this game of diplomacy. I warned Austria that if he kept moving in my direction, it would hamper my ability to actually help against Germany. And he muttered something back, and we shuffled units back and forth. No progress against Germany happened. I was threatened by various different Austrian moves, and before I knew it, he made a very ill-advised move into Venice. At this point, I tried to use chainsaw diplomacy. I threatened, demanded, made it an inviolable condition of any future cooperation that he destroy his fleet so he would no longer have any possibility of stabbing me by sea, which would pretty much make any further advancement against the Italian peninsula impossible for him. I said Austria could not be trusted with a fleet, and if he didn't destroy this thing, I would throw the game to Germany. And I truly believe that a good player, at this point, even if he had made all the same bad decisions as Austria thus far, would have seen that Germany could take Norway and St. Pete, as I was saying, and I could easily convey Venice to Germany as I was promising to do, so the Austrian player would be dooming himself, and the other players we were trying to work with, to a German solo if he didn't comply with my one condition. But this Austrian player wasn't very good at diplomacy in the first place, and he didn't care that much about this game in particular either, so he refused. Repeatedly and spitefully, and with no real logic to it, nor concern for the fact that it would directly cause his defeat. Some players don't really care about winning as long as they get to be stubborn and obnoxious along the way, and he was one of them, unfortunately. So I followed through on my threat, and that is how the game ended. The conclusion I come to is that chainsaw diplomacy has hardly ever really worked well in my experience. When I look for examples of it being used properly and succeeding, I come up basically empty. It's only applicable to maybe one power per game in the first place, in terms of you winding up in a position where it would make sense for you to try this threatening, demanding, semi-irrational approach to one of your neighbors. It's difficult to actually do it effectively for most diplomacy players, and usually being effective at this means you're a difficult to get along with player in the first place, which is obviously quite bad in diplomacy. So frequently that would mean you don't actually reach the point in the game where this would be appropriate and or effective. It's possible that this might have not worked as well for me as it should have, because it went against my nature. I am naturally a soft, gentle, kind, sweet soul, sometimes misunderstood, but at any rate, I cannot recommend chainsaw diplomacy as a tool based on my experience unless you're both in the kind of position I've been describing where it would be useful, and you're in a game where people are fairly certain to care about winning or losing. Some people do not care. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm surprised to see that it's still true that a majority of my viewers on each video are not subscribed, according to my YouTube analytics. Considering how many subscribers I have versus the numbers of views on each video, that seems improbable. But I'll assume it's true for now. If you're one of these people, I hope you'll like this video and either subscribe or leave a comment telling me why you don't believe in YouTube subscriptions. If not that, then please let me know in the comments below if you've seen chainsaw diplomacy used effectively, or if you've merely seen it being a style that too many people default to that usually isn't very effective. Please also give a warm hand to our most committed supporters, the patrons and translators who are now credited on screen. My Patreon link is in the description. Patrons get access to exclusive diplomacy content, as well as early access to my videos, so it's not a bad value for $1 per month. Till next time, Florida Man out.